Could we actually see Florida State and Clemson leave the ACC or announce they're going to leave the ACC by June 30th of this year? Could it happen that quickly? Well, I'm going to bring on a guest who thinks it's very well possible. And we're going to talk to that guest right after this word from my sponsor. Ladies and gentlemen, this episode is brought to you by Dutch Miller Automotive, where friends and family pricing means you get the best deal right up front on any new or pre-loved vehicle in stock every time. With brands like Chevrolet, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram, Kia, Hyundai, Ford, GMC, Buick, and Subaru, the Dutch Miller Automotive family is always growing and ready to put you in the car or truck you've been searching for. Check out our inventory across West Virginia at DutchMillerAuto.com or come in today to the home of friends and family pricing, only at a Dutch Miller Automotive store near you. What is up? Come on in, make yourself comfortable, and belly yourself up to the bar, and let me pour you out another shot of top-shelf college football content. On tap at Couz's Corner today, we're once again talking about the ACC versus Florida State versus Clemson situation. We're going to talk about how this thing could actually implode on the ACC a lot sooner than many think, and it could happen as early as June 30th of 2024. And to talk about this, I'm going to bring on a very special guest who's talked about this over on his show, College Football Addiction, Mr. TJ Pittinger. TJ, how you doing?
Man, I'm good. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you coming back on the show, man.
Yeah, Couz, been a minute. I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. For those folks who want to check you out on social media, where can they find you?
Yeah, TJ_Pittinger on Twitter, X, whatever it's being called these days, and then on YouTube, like you said, College Football Addiction is where we're doing a lot of conference realignment stuff these days.
Awesome. So, TJ, I watched a couple of your recent episodes on conference realignment, and you've kind of dropped somewhat of a bombshell the other day talking about the Florida State, Clemson, ACC situation, and talking about how because of a composition clause in the contract that the ACC could actually implode or start imploding anyway as early as June 30th of this year, because that's when you think FSU and Clemson could potentially announce they're leaving. Can you kind of go into why that composition clause matters and how that works and why that June 30th date is so important?
Sure. So we'll dive into that and then we'll go 30,000 foot. But
yes,
the date is important because the next day, Cal, Stanford, and SMU become official members. And you would need a lot more than just two teams to break away for the conference to dissolve, right? And we've actually mentioned that date quite often in regards to some other things. Like if you were going to dissolve the conference and vote on it, you need a simple majority. Well, a simple majority of 15 is going to be less than a simple majority of 18. So new teams officially joining the conference is going to have an impact on some of that stuff. I believe that ESPN isn't super thrilled with the ACC adding those three teams. I think the ACC was, I don't know, they were in a bad spot. There weren't a lot of good options, but the ACC kind of knew like, hey, we may lose two or three teams, probably Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina. And if that happens, ESPN can cancel our contract because the composition clause would be in effect. So what they did was they added three new teams. And the composition clause doesn't say like, oh, Florida State's got to be part of the conference for us to. No, the composition clause just says you have to have this many teams. I don't think when they were writing this stuff 25 years ago, they thought like, oh, Florida State might break away and then we're going to have Cal in their place or something like that.
Right.
And so the composition clause just says you got to have X number of teams. Well, the ACC kind of tried to, I don't know if I want to say try to pull a fast one, but maybe try to pull a fast one by saying like, well, we're going to lose three teams. Let's add three teams so that we don't lose any money from ESPN. That sounds great, but I don't think it made ESPN super happy knowing like, okay, we got to basically pay what we were paying for Florida State, Clemson, and UNC. The only reason we really pay this conference, and now we're getting Cal, Stanford, and SMU. Like, what kind of media, like what kind of swap is that? So I've been told that ESPN has already told the ACC that they are not going to renew the media rights deal in 2027. The deadline for that is February of 25. So I don't think that ESPN is super happy with the ACC in doing that.
Right.
I don't think it puts ESPN in a great position. Now, I do think they've got a good enough of a working relationship where they haven't just come out and confirmed that. And that's not like mainstream, like Beresily and Josh Pate haven't reported on that, right? Like Dennis Dodd and all those guys. But I think it's somewhat known. Like that has happened. And I don't think anybody expected that ESPN would extend that agreement in 2025, February 25 for the 27 year. But I think it's already kind of been decided. And so, again, zooming back out, not to be long-winded on it, I think that if there's a chance that ESPN could just get this over with and done now and either get a settlement in place so that they can then move their properties, whether that be Florida State, Clemson, UNC, to the SEC or to the Big Ten, wherever they end up landing, they can start this next round and know what that looks like for future media deals with new conferences. But the longer this drags out, the more of a weird spot it puts everybody in, right? Puts Florida State and Clemson in a weird spot, puts the ACC in a weird spot, puts ESPN. I think all parties, maybe besides the ACC, just kind of want some finality of like, hey, this is what's going to happen. And so you've got these lawsuits going on. And I truly think that ESPN wants Florida State and the ACC and then Clemson and the ACC to settle before June 30th. And the leverage that's being used right now to try and force that settlement to happen sooner rather than later is the fact that Florida State and Clemson could blow this thing up if they announce, hey, we're leaving, we're out, retroactive, date it back, we're out, and we're not going to be part of the ACC anymore. And so will they blow it up? Will it get to a point where we don't have it? I don't know. But I think there's a really good chance that we either get a settlement or we get some kind of an announcement before June 30th from at least those two schools that this is what they're doing.
Gotcha. And my question was going to be, why would ACC, and I think you somewhat answered it. My question was going to be, why would ESPN back out of the deal on June 30th or have that firm date, I guess, if they knew they were getting the other three teams? I know they may not want those three teams, but it's my understanding they didn't specify in the contract who the teams had to be. They just said you can't drop below 14 teams, right? So if it mattered who the 14 teams were, then why didn't they put some kind of language in there saying, upon approval or whatever, some kind of legal language to specify, hey, we're not going to give you this just for anybody. It has to be teams of certain value or something like that. What do you think? Why do you think that is?
I just think back then there wasn't like, we didn't, 3 years ago, we didn't really know what like the conference realignment landscape was going to look like, let alone like 25 years when some of these media rights deals are being written. I don't think we knew that like teams massive brands like this would be jumping conferences. Right. And so like you could say like, oh, they didn't have the forethought to do that. But like, I mean, if I would have told you all this was going to go down, back when, Cam Newton and Vince Young were in school, you'd have been like, nah, dog, you're crazy. Like no chance that Florida State and Clemson are going to tear apart the ACC.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think they ever really, knew. And then you can also get yourself into some trouble like that. Like what if, what if you are signifying, like you put Florida State and Clemson, like Clemson, again, 15, 20 years ago, we wouldn't even have thought of them. Like even when this was written, Clemson wouldn't have been one of the teams that they would have put anyway. It would have been Florida State and Miami. Right. And so you can get yourself into trouble with that. Like what if you would have written Florida State and Miami and then Clemson could just get out for nothing right now with their value. So, and then, I would never predict that like Florida State's going to fall off, but like, what if Florida State would have fallen off, right? Like what if Jimbo Fisher didn't come around and they hired Willie Taggart like after Bobby and like things just really, I mean, I don't even know that he was available then, but like, a hire like
an
that.
example. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they put Florida State and Miami, and then we get 20 years down the road and Florida State and Miami are just shells of themselves. Like what if Florida State was in Miami's position there? So even if they would have had the forethought, I don't think they would have ever written like, could you imagine the SEC writing right now? Like, hey, you can't do this, but you got to keep Alabama and Texas and Georgia, and then everybody else is fair game. Like, could you imagine how that would upset the rest of the members?
I get it. And I probably didn't ask the question the right way, but I wasn't meaning write specific teams in, but make the language so to where ESPN has the ability to approve, or it's based on a market value,
sure,
or something like that. Some kind of language to say, hey, if you add teams to offset, it's at the discretion of ESPN, or we don't have to pay pro rata, something like that. You know what I'm saying? Because they do have the pro rata agreement in there as well, as my understanding. So, it seems to me like ESPN should have maybe been more forward thinking in the way they wrote up the contract.
Yeah,
as to not allow ACC to add teams that they don't really approve of or want in the conference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like a final say on how this is going to go, like who you can add, who makes sense. Like you have to come to us to approve any additions.
Correct. Before we pay you pro rata money.
Yeah. So I agree with that. But they are kind of exercising that right, because they have and this is just more so luck of the draw timing, but they are kind of exercising that right when you think about the fact that they have the ability in February to extend or not extend. I think they're going to make it pretty clear. And I think they already have to the ACC behind closed doors. They're going to make it pretty clear, like, hey, we're not a big fan of the fact that you did this, and we're not going to extend you guys.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like you've got some sources that have given you some of this info. So why is it that the ACC, and maybe you know this, maybe you don't, maybe, if not, just give me your opinion. Why do you think the ACC didn't go to ESPN before they added these three schools?
I think
talk about it with them first.
Yeah, I think ESPN would have said, like, no, we don't like this. Like we like what? Right. And how many options did not that you're not going to hear me like defend the ACC too much, but like how many options did they really have? Like they were gonna, like, we knew this time last year that Florida State and Clemson were not going to be in this conference, whether it's 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. Like we knew that, right? And so, like, what options did the ACC really have? Like, I mean, Notre Dame was never going to join as a full member. And so, like, but that's maybe the best one, the best option they had. And so, the Big 12 had more stability because you knew that Florida State and Clemson were leaving. And so, like, I don't really know what else they could have done. I get it. Like, why not go to the ACC and try and work something out? But like, or ESPN, I'm sorry. But I think their thought was like, well, if we go tell ESPN that we know these teams are leaving, they're going to try and block it. They're like, we just need to get, like, almost like, rob Peter to pay Paul. Like we just need to get these other teams in and do it quickly and quietly, and that'll save us.
A desperation move, basically.
For sure. Because they just didn't have a lot of options. Like, we get on them and say, like, man, this is a terrible move. Why did they do this? But like, again, what did I want them to do? Like just sit there and die. Like they're trying anything they can to grab onto a lifeboat, as the Titanic goes down.
Yeah. So do you think this, how confident are you, TJ, in this June 30th date?
I mean, I feel like
on a percentage basis.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I'm very confident. I'm 100% confident that that's when, that's when if something's going to happen, that's when it needs to happen. I fluctuate, as days happen, days you feel better or worse, like just like a recruit or a big game coming up on Saturday, right? Like one day you feel like you're super confident. The next day you feel less. I fluctuate between like 75 and 90%. Like I think Florida State and Clemson are going to announce that they're leaving the conference before August 16th. I think it is this year, 13th. It's weird because of a weekend. It's like the final business day of the ACC, like the day they have to let the ACC know if they're in again, for 2025 or not. So they're gonna do it that way anyway. By then, anyway. Like I'm 99% confident of that. And so why you wouldn't just back it up like 45 days until June 30th? Like I go between 75 and 90% confident that like something happens there. Like it wouldn't shock me at all if a settlement happens before there. We didn't talk about the lawsuits, and I don't know if we'll get to them or not. But like, these things are not going to court. Like there will be a settlement. And I think ESPN is pushing pretty hard for a settlement to happen. So you asked me like my confidence level. Like I'm not like 100% confident that, the ACC is blown up by Florida State and Clemson. I think most likely what happens is a settlement happens before June 30th, before that nuclear option is launched. And if a settlement doesn't happen, that's when I really think that, Florida State and Clemson kind of like throw the ball up and say like, all right, well, we're going home then.
Yeah. If you look at the settlement piece, and I'm actually glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask about that anyway. If they do settle, don't you think that opens the door for other schools like UNC, maybe Virginia, Miami, whoever, to also settle and try to get out with a settlement? Would it not set a precedent?
I think it does. I think the big thing for them is like, what are the other stipulating factors? Like I'm pretty confident that Florida State, Clemson, UNC, maybe Virginia, probably Miami, have landing spots.
Mhm.
Are we super confident that anyone outside of there does? I know some teams could go to the Big 12, but is that like a way better situation like right now? I mean, I think it will be in 5 years for sure. But
Right.
like, is that, are you going to, can an NC State pony up $200 million in a settlement just to go make basically the same thing
Right.
in the Big
That
12?
makes sense. Yeah.
So, yeah, I would expect that teams like Virginia, North Carolina, others would be right behind, but it might stop with only a couple more. I also wonder too, like there's all this about like sunshine laws and like open act, like Florida State's obviously a public university. And so like some of their arguments in court are like, we need these documents open because we're a sunshine state. Like you have to put the law, and a lot of states have that. North Carolina has something similar. A lot of public records, like public universities are going to have to fall under that. But I wonder, like with settlements and stuff, there are some certain ways that like NDAs can be written where you can, you go settle with Florida State for, let's call it 200 million, and then you NDA it so that number
Never gets out.
put out, and then Miami or NC State comes to you and says like, we want to settle. You say, okay, $500 million, and they don't know what that number with Florida State is. There's probably going to be speculation and stuff, but I think that's something else too. I'm not 100% confident, I'll tell you that, on all the laws, and if they could truly NDA it with, like they could NDA it with Miami immediately because they're a private university, but I don't know if they can. My thought is they could probably find a way to NDA it with Florida State too. I'm not 100% confident, but that's probably the best way the ACC could keep it from trickle down. And the fact of, again, does NC State have $500 million to go out and negotiate with right now? Like probably not.
Right. Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, there's probably only a handful of schools in the ACC that can afford a $200 million, and we're just using $200 million as an estimate of a settlement.
Sure.
That's just assuming theoretical conversation here that they settle for $200 million. Could a Wake Forest or an NC State or whoever, just throw out a name, afford to settle for $200 million?
Right? Yeah, because
like
if you're Florida State and you settle for $200 million and you're making $40 to $50 million more a year just off of like the TV and the college football playoff deals in the Big Ten, like that doesn't count like when Ohio State comes to your campus and what that does for your boosters, ticket sales, and all that stuff. But like, Florida State pays that off in 5 years. If you pay 200 and you make another $40 million a year, then that debt is paid off, right? You've broken even, whatever. Wake's not going to the Big Ten or the SEC, right? Like they have to pay that off over 50 years. Well, you might as well just stay where you're at that point.
Yeah, agreed. What do you think? I mean, I will touch on the court cases a little bit here, but I'll be honest with you. I find that stuff extremely confusing. It makes my head spin. So I can't get it too far in the weeds with it, but we all know what's happened. Basically, the ACC tried to, I guess, stay or whatever the term is. They basically tried to get the delay the ruling on whether or not the case can be heard in the state of Florida. They lost, so it will be heard in the state of Florida. And then also the same thing happened basically with Florida State trying to get it thrown out in North Carolina.
Sure.
So right now they're on parallel paths to have potentially two court cases going on simultaneously, right?
Yeah. There's been a lot.
Three if you count Clemson.
Clemson's as well, yeah. And then a fourth, fourth with Clemson as well, because then North Carolina sued them back. True. I do think the North Carolina ones will get merged. And ultimately, I think this ends up in North Carolina. But there's been a lot made about the court cases so far. And it really breaks down to simply like kind of exactly what you just said. Like both parties, just Florida State and UNC, Florida State and the ACC have sued each other. And just like if you sued me, the first thing that I would do is I would go to that judge and say, hey, his case has zero standing. Just throw it out. Like, let's not even go to court. Just throw his case out. And if I sued you, you'd do the same thing. And that's all that's happened. Florida State sued the ACC, and the ACC said, we can't be sued, throw it out. And then the ACC sued Florida State, and Florida State said, we can't be sued, throw it out. And both of those have basically, the judges in both cases said like, no, you can be sued like that. Right. Both these cases are proceeding on. Now, where does it eventually go? Does it get kicked up to federal court? Does one court end up, kind of backing off a little bit, or do both courts press on and we get two different rulings? That's all to be determined. But honestly, nothing has really happened so far. It has just been like both sides have said, hey, we can't be sued. And both judges said, yeah, you can.
Yeah, that's kind of a great summary. I mean, I've seen a lot of people cover this stuff. I'm like in detail, and I'm like, man, it makes my head spin. So I don't even attempt it. But yeah, what do you think ultimately happens at the end of the day? Do you think the ACC is able to survive? I mean, and let's look ahead 5 years to 2031. Okay, do you think the ACC is able to survive and remain a conference? What do you think it looks like if it does? What's your opinion long term on the ACC?
I would lean towards yes, because they will get some pretty good settlement money out of this, and I don't think that 200 number is too far off. But if you collected that from 2 or 3 members, you're talking of somewhere between 600 and $3/4 of $1 billion, like that. That can kind of keep you afloat for a little while. But they need to reprioritize, and they need to they're no longer going to be a football power. Like, that's just what it is, right? Like, eventually Florida State, Clemson, UNC are going to be gone. I think NC State goes. I think Virginia Tech goes. With Virginia, I think Miami ends up going. I think Louisville ends up going. I think Pitt and Louisville probably end up in the Big 12. Like, they're going to lose like 8 or so teams, right? And so do they pull some group of 5 teams up and just kind of like rebrand a little bit as kind of, they pull USF up, right? That'd be a valuable team to pull into the ACC.
Tulane, maybe.
Yeah, they pull a Tulane, get that New Orleans area, right? Like get some stuff. Like, I don't know if ECU is really worth it or not, but I don't know. Just pull some stuff from the area that you're in right now and get you up to like 12 or 14 teams and just kind of accept your place, be a basketball conference, with maybe what's left. I don't know. I could see the Duke leaving for the Big 12 as well. Or even, if the SEC really wants to prioritize hoops, like bringing Duke in too. And so I think they're going to be in trouble, but you're essentially the Big East at that point, right? Like you kind of build it back up and just understand that, like, hey, we're not going to be a football power. We're not going to be a Power 5 conference by any means, but this is the direction we're going to go. And if they just kind of like accept that, like, hey, we're going to exist as a conference. We're not going to make the money we used to, but we've got a $600 million net behind us. And then what are you settling with every other team for, right? You may settle with other teams for less. You might have $1 billion at the end of the day, right? And from there, can you keep your conference of, keep your group of 5 conference afloat? Group of 5 conferences still make money, right? It's not the level the ACC is used to. But I mean, if they're okay with that, like, I don't think that would be a massive issue. Like, they just understand, like, that's just kind of what you are at that point.
Yeah.
Like, who's the best team left? Georgia Tech? And maybe somebody wants Georgia Tech for the Atlanta market. I don't know. But your best teams are going to be like Boston College, Syracuse. USF will probably end up running it at some point just because of the location they're in. But yeah, that's kind of my vibe or gut on it.
Sounds like Jim Williams, who's a friend of the show, he put out a tweet a few months ago basically saying that the ACC's, I guess, maybe behind the scenes, I don't remember the details of the tweet, but basically he actually could see it. If these teams do end up leaving, the people are expecting to eventually leave, they could end up being like basically somewhat of an Ivy League type deal where they want to bring in several, high academic institutions, to go, if they're assuming they're able to keep Duke and Stanford on, Wake Forest, maybe they go get, Tulane has very high academic standards. Well, USF is now an AAU university, so maybe they go get them. There's and there were a few others in there as well.
They should add the military schools,
and they might make their focus more around academics than sports at that point.
And they still have really good Olympic sport.
Right.
With Stanford, obviously they have 1 billion sports and they win the Director's Cup every year. But, some of those schools still do a really good job, like Olympic sport wise. And then they should go get the military schools, like get that Army Navy game, and I know that that's not like the sexiest thing in the world. I mean, obviously that game itself does great, but like go get those 2 schools and add those to your conference. And then then you do get a pretty good, you'll get a pretty big bump from that at the end of the year. You'll have Army and Navy playing all of your schools every year. I don't know how feasible that is or not, but I've seen that tossed around some. I don't think that's a bad plan for the ACC to go out and try and pick up those 2 schools if they have any interest in joining something like that.
Right. And the last question I'll ask you is centered around Florida State, Clemson, but individually. Where do you think those 2 schools end up at the end of the day? when the dust settles.
Man, there is so much smoke around the Big Ten, and that's where everybody like really feels like Florida State ends up. But I can't shake the idea that they'll just eventually end up in the SEC. Like, I don't know, maybe these big time conferences just end up splitting apart, or joining up anyway, and just kind of creating, not like the Super League that we saw the other day, but just kind of end up creating a really big, powerful, like massive Big Ten SEC combo. But I don't know. I just think they make so much more sense geographically in the SEC. I could see the Big Ten either way, but like my gut still kind of says, like, I guess my head says the Big Ten, my heart says the SEC. Like, I just can't see them getting out of the South. And honestly, I don't see the SEC wanting the Big Ten, to be in Florida and South Carolina there and get those brands. And then I don't see ESPN wanting to lose those two.
That's been my gut feeling too. Yeah. That's been my feeling too. But then you hear other people say, "But the SEC doesn't want to expand right now." Please, they always say that.
They've said that for years.
Yeah. Now, what do you think? Clemson and Florida State end up landing in the same league, or do you think one goes to the Big Ten and one goes to the SEC?
I think they end up in the same league if it's the SEC. I think if Florida State goes to the Big Ten, they end up separating. That's a very political answer, right? I didn't really give you an answer, but I don't know that I see Clemson as a fit for the Big Ten. I could see like the SEC and the SEC and the Big Ten are playing a lot nicer than I think a lot of people would even think that they ever would. Yep, and so I could see them splitting them, and the Big Ten saying, "Well, leave us something. We'll take Florida State. You get UNC and Clemson. We'll take Florida State and Virginia, or Florida State and Miami, or whatever. Like, we'll go that route." I could see that. I could see Florida State and Miami staying in a conference together more than I could Florida State and Clemson. I think that rivalry is a little bit stronger.
Interesting. Well, and two, Miami's already an AAU institution.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know that matters to the Big Ten, at least a lot of the members anyway. So, and Florida State appears to be working towards that, and we know they've drastically increased their research funding. So they're trying to work towards an AAU, even though they may not officially be in yet. They're working towards it, and they seem to be. Soon, and they're already doing a lot more research funding than some of the other schools already in the Big Ten. So, or that will be joining anyway.
I think Florida State's president really wants the Big Ten. I think he wants to be there for sure. Does he end up having enough pull? I don't know, but I do think he wants to be there for sure.
Right. Fair enough. Well, TJ, one more time, man, before I let you out of here, let my listeners know where they can find you and your work, and also find you on social media.
Yeah. Social media is TJ_Pittinger, Pittinger. And then again, College Football Addiction. We've talked a lot of conference realignment. There's a playlist that you can go back if you want to go and binge with a lot of good stuff on there. So come check us out.
Absolutely. Yeah. TJ, I appreciate you coming on, man. I'm sure you've taken a lot of crap for some of the stuff you put out because you're the only one talking about some of this stuff, man. So, and a lot of people don't believe it. And I know how that is. I've done it a few times myself, and you get some pushback. Have you gotten a lot of pushback on that?
A little bit, but I think our track record helps with that. Like we've been talking about this stuff, and I know it's crazy. Like we try to address that. Like I try very much to be like, look, I know you're not going to believe this, but I'm just passing along what I'm told. Right. And I hate to be one of those guys that's like, oh, well, I was told this, so I know that it's my name, it's my credibility, like that goes out there on the line. And if I'm wrong on this, we're going to be wrong, and we're going to move on, and we're still going to be.
It is what it is. Hey,
none of us are going to be. Still
none of us are right.
95%.
Exactly. I was going to say nobody's right all the time, right? Nobody bats 1,000 is the way I like to say it.
But I check the different message. YouTube does a good job of telling you like where your stuff is posted. So I check the different message boards and stuff. And I'll tell you, like where we were like 6 months ago, and people just saying like, man, this guy's crazy. Didn't have any idea what he's talking about. There's a lot of people, even on like non-FSU message board, like FSU message board, like, they say like, oh yeah, TJ, kind of knows what he's talking about. But like, I've read the Clemson ones. I've read the UNC ones. I've read the Miami ones even. And and a lot of them are coming around and saying like, he sounds pretty crazy in this, but he's been hitting at a pretty high clip this, for the last 12 months. Like I need to see it to believe it, but I wouldn't be shocked at all if this ends up being right. So I don't know. I need a settlement to get done by June 30th so that people don't cancel me.
I hear you. Awesome, man. Listen, thanks again for coming on. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to jump on with me and let my listeners know, the ones who hadn't already heard about it, and kind of dive deep into this subject, because I think it's very interesting. And, who doesn't like to hear about conference realignment and what's going to happen with Florida State and the ACC. And obviously us Big 12 people have an interest in it because we could end up getting some of those teams down the road. So we're all very vested in it as well. So So thanks again, and appreciate you coming on, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate you.
Yep. And everybody, don't forget, join the channel, become a VIP member like the fine folks at the bottom of the screen, Browns and Beers, PW Riggs, Roy Harrison, Matthew 1981. Take advantage of the membership perks I have over there. And then thank you for tuning in. But have a top shelf day and Q Country Roads.